Ganesh, go ahead.
Yes. So welcome to all of you to the Speaking from Margin for our lecture series on the research methodology. So for today's, we have our speakers, Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri and moderator Khushbu. So I would like to request Khushbu for introduce the themes and the speakers. Over to you, Khushbu. Thank you.
Thank you, Ganesh. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So, hi everyone. On behalf of Speaking from Margin, I welcome you all to the first lecture of our Research Methods Lecture Series 2023. Speaking from Margin is an academic platform for research scholars, socio-political activists, and students to engage with contemporary discourses of social sciences. It attempts at building academic solidarities for achieving social justice in higher education. We use this space to build solidarity among researchers from various marginal locations to engage with evolving knowledge paradigms within social sciences. In the past, we have organized several lectures and book discussions which have received amazing responses from the academic community and beyond. Our past speakers include Professor Kancha Ilayya, Professor Rajiv Bhargav, Professor Satish Deshpande, Professor Nandini Sundar, Professor Soumya Brat Chaudhuri, Professor Zoya Hassan, Dr. Nasreen Chaudhuri, Dr. Rahul Verma, Professor Neera Chandok, Professor N. Sukumar, and Dr. Sudhir Kumar Suthar, among others. We are extremely delighted to begin our Speaking from Margin Research Method Lecture Series 2023 with this very important discussion on theorizing gender in social science research, a sociological perspective, with our today's speaker, Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri. Professor Chaudhuri has taught at Center for Study of Social Systems, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New
वीडियो ऑन
Delhi.
रखो अपना तो
Her research interests have been on the making of public discourse in modern India. Her early work focused on nationalism, colonialism, and feminism in India. Since the early 1990s, she has been looking at the changing nature of public discourse in the context of both new liberalism and the rise of majoritarianism. She has authored several articles and books which include Refashioning India, Gender, Media, and a Transformed Public Discourse, and the Indian Women's Movement, Reform and Revival. Her edited volumes include Sociology in India, Intellectual and Institutional Practices, Feminism in India, and Doing Theory, Locations, Hierarchies and Disjunctions, co-edited with Professor Manish K. Thakur. We express our heartfelt gratitude to Professor Chaudhuri for agreeing to today's discussion. Through our Research Methods lecture series, we try to bring to our audience and participants the opportunity to interact with experts from various social science disciplines with the objective of facilitating aspiring researchers in getting a better hold of social research methods and equip themselves uh, better with a variety of issues, debates, and discussions lying therein. This series is also an attempt on our part to address the issue of accessibility as faced by students and researchers from marginal spaces, colleges, and universities located remotely from these privileged spaces of knowledge production, and try to minimize this gap as much as possible. So just to sort of start today's discussion, I think that the social sciences in India has historically struggled in engaging with the gender question as a separate, meaningful, and significant issue in its own right, thereby making it a supportive, ancillary, and hence a marginal question for the mainstream theorizing. The dominant discourses in social sciences on questions like that of anti-colonial nationalism, nation building, economic development, and later the discussion on democratic upsurges, new economic reforms, and rise of right-wing majoritarianism have repeatedly evaded questions pertaining to how power differentials operate along the axis of gender and create different lived realities for people of different marginalities, especially for women, trans persons, and sexual minorities of different castes, classes, educational and occupational backgrounds. It is to the credit of various scholars, like the one we are eagerly waiting to listen to for today's discussion, that the social science scholarship was kept on toes uh, as far as its treatment of the gender question is concerned, which eventually prevented it from taking a backseat. The relevance of today's discussion lies in understanding how, in the contemporary times, the question of gender as the central focus can be observed, read, analyzed, and theorized, operating under the flux of multiple socio political and economic processes taking place at the moment. As anti caste scholarship has brought to our attention, the traditional tools for dealing with the gender question have fallen flat as far as the task of capturing the lived realities of Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi, as well as Pasmanda Muslim women is concerned. The question remains, which methodological tools can one use to capture the lived realities of marginalized gender identities constituted as a result of intersections of multiple marginalities, while maintaining a fine balance between researchers' sensitive gaze and the arising ethical questions. How can one, as a researcher, capture the fluidity of concepts in social sciences which keep on changing their meanings as per the context they originate in and are applied to? Can gender, if taken as a category for understanding oppression, exploitation, discrimination, and marginalization, suffices to produce at least a basic universal language which can articulate experiences of women in different parts of the world? Do concepts like intersectionality fracture the production and dissemination of such a universal language, or does it equip us in a more fundamental sense to be more aware of the possibilities of producing the similar structure of domination that one seeks to challenge through production of such a universal language in the first place? I am sure that we should be able to better understand all these issues as we move forward with today's discussion. Now, without taking any further time, let me put forward the format of today's discussion. Ma'am, you have 40 minutes of time for making your presentation, after which we shall open the floor for questions and discussion. With these concerns, I invite Professor Chaudhuri to begin today's discussion. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Khushbu. I'm sort of, I don't teach any longer on an everyday basis, so I'm so impressed with the kind of articulation that young scholars have. Last time I heard Ganesh, and today I'm hearing you, Khushbu. So I'm really very, very happy to be here. And at the outset, I would like, to congratulate the team Speaking for a Margin for starting this platform. We are historically at a point of time, at a juncture where we need more and more such, platforms to speak, express our ideas, literally have, virtual classrooms in a certain sense, which maybe, are under serious challenges, as all of us are familiar today. Now, I was listening to you with great interest, Khushbu, and I don't know whether my presentation would be able to answer all these questions, And what I'm trying to do, when I heard that the effort for this particular series on methods and methodology, I was wondering this discussion. What we have is, people would ask you to speak on feminist method or feminist theory, assuming that if we sort of have 1, 2, 3 steps of doing feminist research, we get it right. I want to sort of slightly complicate and also simplify. I want to historicize this question of theorizing. And the values I'm speaking from today are twofold. One is that I come from a generation when we were students, including when we joined JNU, almost 45, 50 years ago. We had no course on gender. We did not have any speciality called gender. We did not have anything called women's studies, gender studies, nothing. Now we are at a particular juncture of time where there is a kind of surfeit of gender, differently expressed, but gender has become part of, you use the word universal language, it's become a kind of, currency, whether it's corporate advertisement, whether it is NGO empowerment classes, or is it's in a certain sense everywhere. Now, what does it mean to speak there instead of invisibility, you have hypervisibility. Look at this presentation today. The second vantage point that I would like to speak on is how do we look at theory in our context, in our country. So very often when I hear young people, and it depends on the location, because you mentioned the point about privilege of learning and learning, have a difference bottom is, of theory constantly changing, or the context of gender constantly changing. Now, does it mean that if it's constantly changing, there is no basis from which we can begin? If it means that today we are at a time when we have questioned the category of gender in universal terms, and we are using the term intersectionality more commonly, does it mean that we don't need to look at older debates? That's the first point I want to ask. Second, as many of young people would say, that older scholars, including our classical scholars, were often gender blind, or they did not take into cognizance gender. So whether it was Durkheim or whether it was Weber, Marx had a slightly more complicated relationship with the question of gender. So does it mean that they become irrelevant when we talk about gender? And I want to argue that we have to have a slightly more nuanced understanding of how do we look at past theory. So I would not say let's begin with what's right now the buzzword, that all this while gender was seen as, in the West, white, middle class, racialized construct, and in the Indian case that it was the Savannah, dominant middle class urban way of gender, and therefore now it's being questioned, and we begin the debate from here. I would like to go back a little bit, and since I found it very interesting because you all termed the lecture "Theorizing Gender in Social Science Research." A sociological perspective. So I want to put certain emphasis on theorizing gender, but even before theorizing gender, on social science research. Is there something which is a core element of social science research? And the reason I'm saying so is because we live in times where, like I said, we have hyper visibility of gender instead of invisibility. So you can have a right-wing political formation also talking about gender. You would have moves which seem democratic, like having an extra column for the third gender, or a recognition of the trans. So it is hyper-visible, certainly acceptable. You have International Women's Day being celebrated by everybody. So in such a context, is there a distinction between social science research and what we in sociology call common sense knowledge, or the distinction between common sense knowledge and social science knowledge? Is there a difference at all? And if we understand that difference, then I think we can look at the question of theorizing gender in a more serious fashion. In your introduction, Khushbu, you mentioned a particular book of mine edited on sociology and India intellectual institutional practices. Now, there's one chapter there. It's not a great chapter, but it has a rough outline on the category of gender. I think it's the last chapter, so if anybody is interested, they could look at it. Now, I'm going to begin, therefore, with the biography of the category of gender. So it's not just that the category becomes fluid or context change, but how did this category emerge? So 50 years ago, when you had the declaration of the International Women's Decade, I was sort of in the last stages of my college, and gender began to make a visible presence in our lives. And those were times, which I mentioned a little while back, we had no courses on gender. We had no knowledge of what was social construction of masculinities or feminities, neither about queer studies or transgender studies. Everything has changed since then, and we have a much more greater familiarity in the contemporary world. People not only know that gender is constructed, they know that gender is an organizing principle of society, and they know that gender works differently and unequally across caste, race, class, nation, and sexual orientation. My only contention is we don't begin with this, that it works unequally across caste, class, race, nation, and sexual orientation. We know that. Just like class also works unequally across class, caste also works unequally. That is the logic of the system. But what we have to go back to fundamentals, particularly in the current time, is what is it which is different between the way we look at gender at the ordinary sense and the social science way of saying. Now, what we have now is greater awareness. So whenever I would speak on gender, people would ask, oh, you said women, you said men, but you did not mention that there are other people with different sexualities or orientation. It's a good question, but it's not a complete question in the sense knowledge keeps increasing. It will keep diversifying, but this does not clinch the argument. I'm just putting this point across because there is a tendency to do that. In my times, gender was confined to the use of grammar, masculine, feminine, neuter. Whenever people said gender, we knew it meant, the pooling, striling, and the third category. There was no other notion. So imagine gender got born as a concept. And to understand the birth of gender as a concept, we have to reiterate the relationship between movement and knowledge. Just like you said, you have the anti-caste movement, the Dalit movement, which questions and interrogates a certain understanding of gender. Likewise, at that point of time, when you had the mainstream dominant women's movement, they were also pushing the frontiers against a certain gender-blind orientation in social sciences. So the relationship of movement and concept is very, very important. So it's not enough to say, how do I do feminist research? Unless you know the biography of feminism and the biography of the category gender. Biographies are important. Now, I sort of wanted to begin here and then prove forward that first the question of the context being different, and the second, that why do we have theory? And there are many explanations, In fact, people don't ask this question too much. There's a certain routinization of theory. Routinization that all syllabus will have a course on theory. Whether it's political science or sociology, they will have courses on theory. Undergraduate syllabus, they'll have a course on theory. UPSC exams will also have something on theory. But we don't ask a fundamental question, why do we have something on theory? And to go back to your introductory remark where you said gender became peripheral. So what happens to theory, there are two tendencies which happen. One, either it becomes peripheral, that they feel, what's the point of theory? Especially as we turn towards a more pragmatic turn historically, and they will say, how does it help us practically? Or they will say in more common sense way, JNU mein to log bahut theory karte hai. What's the faida of it? Okay, so theory is seen something as optional. You can do theory, you cannot do theory. My argument, which all of you know, is that in social science we cannot proceed without theory, because there is nothing called pre-theoretical. There is nothing called pre-theoretical, by which I mean that when we observe a phenomena, we already observe it with certain categories in our head. So when I look at, there's a park outside my flat, and I see people, children playing, women walking, men walking, etc. I already have the category, men walking, women walking, children playing. And unless I have this concept of men, women, children, I will not be able to give labels or understand what is happening. So there is nothing pre-theoretical. There's nothing. Supposing I see I can also distinguish a middle-class woman walking in the park and maybe a domestic woman, a worker, or a construction labor woman walking in the park. And I can therefore impose my common sense knowledge about class on those categories, on what I see. So the first thing I want to tell everybody, the reason why do we theory is not out of choice. We do theory in order to have a conversation between our accepted, taken for granted ideas and social science theory. I speak a little more on it by making the distinction between what we call common sense knowledge and social science knowledge. So in common sense knowledge is what we speak every day, what we talk to people in our everyday language. When I see somebody and I say, look, a family is working, a family is catching a train, or their family is going out for a picnic. Now, I am using the word family as an idea of what a family is. So if I see a man, a woman, and children, I assume this must be a nuclear family. That means without doing a course on family and kinship, I already have an idea about what a family is. And that idea of the family that I have is something I learned just by living in my everyday life. I grew up in a particular kind of family. I know what cousins mean, what uncles mean, what grandfathers mean, grandmothers mean. It is experiential, but like all common sense knowledge, it is specific. So if I belong to a privileged caste or a privileged class, then my knowledge of what a family means comes from my experiences as living there. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Dorothy Smith's work. She's an amazing scholar, and she gives a very interesting example that she was located in Canada. She was a feminist sociologist, and she tries to explain this relationship between concepts and observation. They were going in a train, and as you know, Canada is a very vast land, and the train was moving, very fast among these very, bare areas. And she was watching the landscape go by, and she saw a woman and some other women and young children sitting together somewhere near the railway lines. And in her mind, she said, look, this is a family. And then she said, but why are they sitting so near the railways lines? Are they waiting for the next train? These were the questions which were arising in her mind. And as the train sped, she said, am I right that is it a family at all? Maybe they are not. They may be just a group of people. Second, is their relationship to the train the same as mine? That I'm a white privileged professor who's waiting for a train to go from one place to another. Now, these people could be the First Nation people, or what we would call in our parts Adivasis, who were removed from their original land for the railways to be built. And there was a lot of tussle between these people removed from their land and the railways. So their relationship to the railways may be very different from a middle-class passenger who uses the train to move from one place to another. So she introduces this concept called relations of ruling, that even when you look at empirically at a phenomena which seems very ordinary, very common sense, a group of people sitting together, you say that, can I see everything visibly, empirically with my eyes? This is a group of people. Can I say they are a family? Can I say they are potential passengers? Or by using the family and passengers, am I imposing my common sense ideas onto a reality which needs a different language to speak? And so she brings in the whole question of sociological knowledge and relations of ruling, that even in our everyday lives, we may feel that, Khushbu's here, I am here, or Ganesh is there. But within our biographies, there are historical relations which define who we are. Are we first generation learners? Are we third generation learners? Are we migrants? Are we rural? Are we urban? Does our family property? Does our family property? What kind of freedom do I have? These are structural questions. But these structural questions are not visible to the eye. So the first thing for research, social science research, is you can't reach unless you have some familiarity with concepts and theorizing, because only theory will help you to question your received wisdom or your common sense categories. I begin on this note because I am sometimes very uncomfortable when they say, oh, let's speak on gender theory and, should we talk about performance? Okay, that's a good thing that you talk about performance, but let's go back a little bit and then discuss how did it all begin. Because there are commonalities between very different feminist theories. There are commonalities between a structural functionalist theory and maybe Marxist theory, even though it may seem blasphemous, because they're both trying to do social science theory. They're trying to engage self-consciously with common sense theory. Now, the first thing that we must realize, and I'm emphasizing it because very often in the contemporary period, when there's a hyper visibility of theory, people feel we know it. We know gender is there. We know there is bias. We know that this is patriarchy. You use words rather like abbreviated forms to box things. Usually to move the thought. Theory is something which moves, and I keep like it so much of Peter. Example that how when he talks about during the war, and you walk down the street and you see these houses and their curtains are shut, windows are closed. You don't know what's happening inside. And then one day there's bombing and you start walking on the same street and you suddenly see, that the house has been stripped apart, broken apart. You see a broken doll somewhere. You see a bed broken and you see the innards of society. We can't bomb to see the innards of society, but we have theory. It's a pretty good bomb if you use it carefully, because the theory strips away the facade and enables you to look at the structure. So patriarchy is not a bad word. Very often you use the word patriarchy almost like, a foul word, like you say, oh, you are patriarchal. Patriarchy is a theoretical framework to understand how gender organizes social structure, how it organizes family, kinship, marriage, how it decides whether you live in a matrilocal or a patrilocal, whether you leave your home as a woman when you get married to live in your husband's home, whether there are songs on Vidai which make people feel weepy, but whether in a matrilineal society those songs have any relevance at all. So how patriarchy, culture, rituals are all very interlinked, but you can't see it unless you have the lens of theory. So theory, to my mind, is a lens through which you see. And this theory enables us to question the common sense knowledge that we already have, constantly question, constantly engage, You have a very interesting way of describing common sense knowledge by Robert Park. This was 1944 in the American Journal of Sociology, where he described it as knowledge by acquaintance. Common sense knowledge is knowledge by acquaintance, and social science knowledge which has to be acquired through theory and method and certain established protocols of validation, So common sense knowledge is by acquaintance. And in today's world of both neoliberalism and majoritarianism, knowledge is usually about acquaintance. Even TV debates are knowledge by acquaintance, If I live in a neighborhood, my uncle has told me this, my nephew actually saw this happen. So all evidence is knowledge by acquaintance. Okay, I believe in this. Nay, aisa hi hota. They are like that only because my grandfather told me or my neighbor told me. So you have knowledge by acquaintance. There is no critique in it. You're not asking, but why did your father tell you that? What was the source of that knowledge? How did he gather that knowledge? How can you question that knowledge? None of this was being raised. So knowledge by acquaintance is almost organic knowledge. The way we learn how to comb our hair, how to dress up, how to speak. Along with that, we acquire knowledge about who we are, Who are the others? Are we higher up in the hierarchy? Are we bottom? Are we marginalized? Are we privileged? How do we deny it? It's almost organic knowledge. In contrast, social science knowledge is a knowledge which begins with the assumption we must question everything. And this comes from the presumptions of science. The whole question we talk about Latin theory, and scientific knowledge is a knowledge which you never takes anything for granted, which questions. There has been a kind of oversimplification of science, where you say, oh, science means validation, science means a prediction, science means control. I don't know whether it means all that, but I know that science means never to accept anything as given unless you sort of know how that knowledge was established. What were the sources? What were the methods? What kind of research program? What kind of statement? It is the procedural nature of science which is important, not whether it can predict or not predict. Most of the time, you can't predict, I mean, that is the relationship between structure and agency, etc. But there are historical patterns. I say this again to problematize science, because there's been a lot of bad-mouthing about reasons why, there's been horrendous, the Holocaust, very patriarchal, hegemonic scientific. But science as a mode of inquiry, I mean, there's a lot to learn from it, That strand must be retained into science knowledge. Now, the common sense approach to knowledge is very, very evident in gender. Very evident. Not only is it very evident, it is provoked. Now that I'm sort of retired and people are more willing to listen to what I have to say, but when I was young and whenever I used to speak on gender, people always looked very uncomfortable. So supposing it was a refresher course and I was talking to young teachers or elderly teachers, the first thing they would say, and it could be anything, it could be nationalism and gender, it could be anything, but they would not look at the part, they would look at the gender part, and they would say, oh, it's not like that. We're all equal. So there is that gender triggers people. They feel it's something personal. And instead of denying it, we must accept it. Because gender is a very core component of identity, just like class or caste is, but even more profound, because it's intimate. It is about who we are. We learn not just how to be a man, but our very expressions, about questions of romance, about love, about attachment to our parents, our siblings, is gender related, and our association with gender. Say Rakhi, it has a lot of, very, very deep sentimental attachment in the northern part of our country, your relationship to your brother, etc. And if you suddenly go and say, oh, it's so patriarchal, you're not going to get a very good response. It is indeed very patriarchal, but it is also indeed extremely emotional. Both can be true at the same time. So it's extremely important to understand the specificity of gender, its pervasive presence in defining who we are. Common sense knowledge as well as feelings. One more response I got in one of my many lectures was that I gave this lecture and then finally somebody got up and they said, Dekhe, gulab to gulabi rahega and kamal kamal hi rahenge. So the idea that it is given, gender is given, it is fixed, immutable, is very, very strong, extremely strong. And anybody who questions it is seen as unnatural. Because this is again an example from one of my lectures where somebody said about how there was this very fancy woman who was walking in the park with her domestic help, and there were two children playing, and she said, what lovely children. And the maid told her, but they are your children. And she said, really? And now why was this story being told to me in a gender course? They were telling me that people who are too articulate or privileged don't look after their children. It is unnatural. They are unnatural mothers. So the natural and unnatural is very deep rooted in gender. And anybody who does research in gender will realize it repeatedly, that it is seen. So feminists are seen as unnatural or not compassionate. Whereas it's very ironical because feminism assumes, you were mentioning about solidarity, empathy, compassion with other marginalized groups, it's inherently compassionate. But you have an assumption that this is something which is unnatural and is not compassionate. So that if we don't understand the seriousness of the distinction between common sense knowledge and social science knowledge, we are going to not reach the core of the particular problem. Then we come to the question that, okay, if there is a fundamental distinction between social science knowledge and common sense knowledge, then what about the various kinds of feminist theories and feminist methods and various kinds of theory? Say in sociology, we begin a very dominant framework of theoretical framework, structural functionalism. So for years, Talcott Parsons was taught and was very central to our theory. Now, if you look at Talcott Parsons' model, he has an assumption of what that men play the instrumental role for a society to function. Women play expressive role. Now, if you look at that model, you suddenly realize that Parsons' common sense knowledge as an American white middle class became part of his theoretical model. The common sense collapsed into the theoretical model. So when we say structural functionalism is very status quo, what we're really saying is structural functionalism is built on an unquestioned model of how society is, So obviously, if you're middle class, urban in the 1950s or 60s in America, most women were housewives of that section. Most men were earning a livelihood. Women did spend a lot of time looking after their children, running the house. So your limited experiential reality got generalized and became part of theory. Even if it was put in a very abstracted form, AGIL, and with many graphs and bars, it was still a very small snippet of your reality put forward as theory. In the Indian case, we had similar kind of hegemonic common sense being imposed, but we didn't have a history of theory. I saw that you all had a very interesting political science theory, theory conference. Like say, when we were young, and I wanted to come, but I couldn't come. And I was very interested because Professor Kaviraj was there and that he was still teaching when we were students and we took his course. And at that point too, the idea of an Indian political theory, or that was not enough. But the Indian case, what happened was that you did have a Parsons, but you had a lot of theorists who imposed their common sense world. So when we say, talk about somebody like Ghure, or the idea of the ancient Hindu woman, or an idea of an unchanging Hindu family, or, those were common sense experientially located by people from that group, but which became imposed as part of academic knowledge. Common sense and academic knowledge, therefore, coincided, became one. In contrast, if you had radical theories, and there were radical theories before feminist theories, say if you take the most obvious example of Marxist theory, you would have an element of critique in it, inherently. So for example, if you look at, say, the idea of the reserve army of labor, the whole question that, the women would not be centrally in work, but when there would be a crisis, like a war, when the men would go out to fight in the war, the women would be brought into the labor, but when they came back, women would be moved out, and so you would have a kind of assumption where you started seeing the larger relations of ruling, to use Dorothy Smith's work, because Dorothy Smith actually combines Marxist theory with ethno-methodology, that experiential reality. then you realize, okay, this has a critical dimension. You're not imposing your own experience on other models, And so, or if you have, of course, Engels' very famous Origin of Family, Private Property in the State, where you start looking into the relationship of how family, marriage, kinship is also linked to larger social formations of property rights, of extraction, or surplus value. For example, the idea that women's work, women's labor would not be recognized, but that labor was necessary to feed and clothe and reproduce the labor power. So the working class man had to go to work, but who would wash his clothes or feed him or cook his meals or look after the house or reproduce children for the next generation of working class would be this domestic space seen as unproductive, but was actually very critical for the perpetuation of capitalism, So you start having an approach which starts looking at larger structures with also very small experiential intimate relationship. In the Indian context, likewise, the anti-caste movement and scholarship say, if you look at Uma Chakrabarti's work, where she looks at the question of widowhood or the reproduction of caste and reproduction of gender. So why women who belong to the privileged section, sexuality was controlled? Because you never could be sure who the father was, so you had to make sure that she got married early, her sexuality was controlled, and you had to make sure that the child was the child by the father. As you move down, the relationship of the people at the bottom, the margins, was very different, because they were being exposed both to the larger caste class hierarchy as well as the patriarchy within the intimate space. The larger patriarchy and the more immediate patriarchy of the family, and how that happened, So these some of the kind of questions of feminist theory should be looked at. I'm sort of beginning on this slightly perhaps unusual trajectory, because very often people say, okay, let's speak feminist theory, and then they say, okay, we speak liberal theory, socialist theory, radical theory, and then we bring in intersectional theory, or etc. I'm a little uncomfortable with that kind of categorization, because very often similar things happened historically at different periods of time. So, for example, many of us in India had to work from an intersectional framework. We didn't know this word. We didn't know there was somebody called Crenshaw who's going to write this paper, and then, intersectionality will happen. But most feminist scholars in India were intersectional in practice. They couldn't write about women without looking into questions of class and caste. It was almost impossible. If you did it, and if you were able to do it, then obviously you are invisibilizing other kinds of hierarchies. But if you look at some of the very prominent feminist scholars from this country, you will see that they engage either with class or with caste or with regions or with Adivasis, or it may not have been done in the same way as it is done by Crenshaw, the way intersectionality has traveled today. But they were trying to engage. Look at somebody like Tarabai Shinde's Stri Purush Tulana, which was written in the I forget the date, 80s or 90s, 1880s or 90s, means more than 130 years. It's absolutely incredible. Now, what was she writing in that? She was writing in that about personal morality. The story begins with that little baby who was killed, found out that mother was a widow. She was punished. So personal morality, blaming the woman, question of sexual sanitization of society, not blaming the man, critique of feudalism, critique of caste, critique of colonialism, everything. So what is she? She is an intersectional feminist analysis. But the word didn't exist. The word did not exist at that point of time. And the hierarchy of international division of labor meant that we were not so confident of using theoretical terms and saying, okay, this is our theory, because the academic production of a legitimacy of concepts is located still in the global north. So they've decided now it's decoloniality all the while. But the point is that the entire scholarship in our parts, which were erstwhile colonized, have been a struggle to make sense of this very complex reality. I think I'm coming to an end of my time. So I want to sort of just go back a little bit and sum up what I was trying to say. Like I said, I could have begun by saying, let's discuss radical, liberal, socialist, intersectional. And I said, let's not do that because there are commonalities between these different things, between a liberal feminist and an intersectional feminist. What is common? What is common is an attempt to go behind the facade and question common sense knowledge. Does it mean they're all the same? No, they're not all the same, because the more mainstream feminists, the liberal feminists, would have a tendency more to impose the experience of the dominant group on their theory. And the marginal, what would be called standpoint theory today, would be to see the world in a much more visible way. You can see through, because you are not burdened by those ideological positions. You can see where you are located. So if you are a construction worker, and if you are a Dalit construction worker, the structure is much more visible to you. You know whether there's caste discrimination or not. You know exactly what contract work means. You know what precarity means. If you are privileged, each of this word is just a word. And it becomes much more difficult to engage with it, So there are differences, but there is also a commonality. There are commonalities, these are all differential attempts to question common sense knowledge. And if we forget that, then we will start using theory more like an ornament, Let's use intersectional analysis now. Let us use Judith Butler's performative. What is she trying to say in that argument? Or if you say, at one point the argument was that gender is socially constructed and sex is biological. So you say, oh no, this is really dated. We know that both sex and gender are performative. It's more complicated because at a very elementary level, what she's trying to say is that gender is socially constructed. What she's trying to say is, like Simone de Beauvoir, that women are made, they're not born. Like men are made, men are not born, just like the trans is made, not born. So they are historically, contextually different, and they're constituted. By emphasizing performance, what she's saying is similar to many other what sociologists have said, repetitive acts, habitual acts, how you talk, how you walk. And this is something, again, many of you may have looked at this wonderful, Garfinkel's work on Agnes. And if you have not, do look at, this was a story of a young boy who decided, to go in for sexual sex change to a young woman. But before the biological surgery, he had learned how to behave like a woman. And people, including the doctors, until they were admitted, did not know that this person was a boy. They thought maybe it is something which is a natural phenomenon. And later they found that he had started taking a pill, one of the birth control pills of his mother, is very young, and developed secondary sexual attributes. But more importantly, that when they asked, how did you know how to talk like a girl, how to dress like a girl, how to behave like a girl, how to gossip like a girl? And they said that I hung around to see how they speak, how they laugh, how they talk. So, it is, when you talk about theorizing gender in social science research, I would ask everybody to keep two things in mind. One is the larger structure, economic, political, social, cultural, property relations, capitalism, feudalism, the big questions, neoliberalism. And second, that it impinges on very intimate spaces of human lives. And the two are not unrelated. So a lot of people feel that feminist research has to be about narratives and voices and not about causal explanations, because that's positivist and that will not give you any answers. My argument would be both are valid. Just like narratives are valid, like Sharmila Rege's work of speaking caste, writing gender, writing caste, where she talks about the testimonies of Dalit women, is absolutely valid. But likewise would be a very complex quantitative analysis about the impact of maybe the land policy on women. Both would be valid. What is important for social science knowledge is to follow the procedures, whether it's in the narrative, qualitative, ethnographic mode, or whether it's in the quantitative mode. The details are important, and people shouldn't rush to ask the latest question, because then you miss out a lot of the rich debates which have gone before us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for such a wonderful lecture. I'm not a student of sociology, but today I certainly felt like one. And it is very interesting to note how political scientists and sociologists look at very similar questions very differently.
Right.
So the way you historicize the entire practice of gender theorizing, and especially the entire discussion on distinction between gender in social science research and common sense knowledge, or the knowledge of acquaintance, and the relationship of reciprocity between them, I thought that entire discussion was very interesting. Also, your talk brought all of us to the basics, to the fundamental questions like why theory, what is the biography of gender, what is the biography of feminism, etc., which gets lost in our everyday processes of theorizing and re-theorizing as researchers. So in the way I heard your presentation, you were arguing for the indispensability of theory. And this argument can be used to enrich this entire debate on theoretical versus empirical, to emphasize on the relationship of complementarity between them instead of them being antithetical to each other. And lastly, for me, we as researchers who keep mired in this dilemma between positivist method or the narrative-based research method, as researchers working on gender questions, your talk proved to be very helpful for so many of us. Now, I would like to open the floor for discussion. People who have questions, they can raise their hands, unmute their mic, and please briefly introduce yourself and put your questions forward. Ma'am, how would you like to respond to questions? Would you like to respond to them one by one, or would you want to collect them, some of them, and then respond?
Yeah, maybe a few of them, if they're similar, then I can respond together.
Right. So anybody has any questions? Ganesh? Right.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am, for this wonderful talk, actually. I have a basic questions like when we call about the theorization, there is a debates come between the theory versus empiricism kind of thing. Though some empirical work is formulate the theoretical junctures, but there is a kind of leveling that has been existing in the academia between the theorist, somebody called the theorist, and what you have mentioned, the Talcott persons and others. Those people who are working on the kind of work like the philosophers and these others theorists, then they are leveling into a kind of theorist. But those who are working like on ethnographies and others kind of empirical work, they are not considered as a theorist. So how do you look this kind of binary between the theory and empiricism that is existing in the academia? So this is my
shall I wait for one or two more and then I'll come back, Ganesh? Is that okay?
Yeah.
So anybody else who has a question? Otherwise, I have one.
Okay.
So ma'am, how does one balance, as a researcher, as somebody working on gender, this entire thing called feminist methodology and the focus on objectivity, which plays a very important role when we talk about research in general and also social science research in particular. So how does one balance these two aspects?
If I may ask, what is your topic, Khushbu?
Right. So, ma'am, I work on politics of intercaste marriages and honor crimes in Haryana.
And Ganesh?
My topic, I'm working on emotions, politics, and identity, analyzing anger in everyday Dalit politics.
Wow. Yeah. So I think there's some question in the chat box, and shall I take that? And
so, shall I read it out for you?
Yeah.
Okay. So there is this question by Avinash, and he says that you mentioned that there is a link between patriarchy and culture rituals in society. Can you elaborate on the same? Also suggest some works to begin with.
Okay. So maybe I'll just go one by one. So what Ganesh was saying, in fact, the reason I edited that book with Manish Thakur on doing theory was that same reason. For example, say even I don't know how it works in political science, but there's usually a hierarchy. So since I did women's studies, it would be really low in the hierarchy if you follow. So, that you teach women in society. But my hierarchy got a little higher when I started teaching theory, because they see it as completely, different. Now, this hierarchy is an empirical fact. And I mean, Ganesh would, y'all are familiar with, the whole idea about what Gopal Guru's writings, etc. The theory is somehow superior than empirical. Now, this is a complete dichotomy and a false dichotomy because there is no pre-theoretical. Say, if you're going to talk about anger, you're saying anger and and the Dalit movement or the Dalit discourse. Now, look at the categories. Anger is a category. Dalit is a category, right? And you have to be very self-consciously engaging with what you mean. Your work can be completely empirical, but what you see and observe is already guided by the categories which you have in your mind and with which you are now reading, writing, listening, and engaging with. So, like I said, just that we had no gender when I was a student in JNU, but neither was the category Dalit there. So you can see how they're historically constituted, and therefore I find historical narratives more useful to understand. One of the reasons why this dichotomy exists, because historically there has been a dominance by the global north about what constitutes theory. So if any of you are interested, about 20 years, yes, more than 20 years ago, because I was asked to do this, editing this, Feminism in India volume. And this was supposed to be a conceptual history of feminism. And including the editors, they felt that there has been no debates on feminism in our country. So what are you going to write about? And when they said there have been no debates, what they meant is, like in the West, they have unhappy marriage of Marxism and feminism. They have a debate between liberal feminism and socialist feminism. And it's couched in a particular way, terminology, etc. Now, my argument, if you read the introduction, I'd be very happy if you read the introduction. I was trying to argue, a lot of feminists actually said they're not feminists. From Sarojini Naidu onwards, to somebody closer home like Indira, everybody said they're not feminists. Now, one way of reading this, no, we're not feminists, is to say that, these people were denouncing feminism. My argument was they were not denouncing feminism, they were trying to articulate a language of difference in a world where that language of difference had not acquired legitimacy. Now it is fashionable, decoloniality, global south, categories from the south. At that point, you are supposed to only speak like the global north. If you are not able to speak like that, you are not a theorist. So my argument was that we did not recognize that our history of doing was a history of theorizing. So when we were trying to understand debates on caste, debates on secularism, debates on religion, they were not happening in term papers and in EPW or in journals. We didn't have these, okay? What we were debating is in the political sphere. If you look at all the people who were involved in the anti-colonial movement, all of them wrote copiously. They were theorizing, every one of them. There's nobody. So those days, if you told somebody that, Periyar has to be seen as a theorist, or, Gandhi has to be seen as a theorist or an anti-capitalist critique, it would be laughed at because we didn't have the language to recognize that theory can also be articulated differently in different places. So the assumption of what constitutes theory is they were theorizing, they were trying to make sense of. They were trying to think out aloud. They were trying to say that, look, democracy can't quite work out in our country the way it worked out there. But we did have the fancy word multiple modernities. So they were doing it without that language. And the language of legitimacy still came from the global north. So now the decolonial is a category. We can all say we are now decolonial scholars, but we were writing 40 years back or 50 years back, or people who were writing 100 years back. Or Tarabai Shinde was writing 130 years back. So they were writing, but how do we recognize that? Were they questioning common sense knowledge? Yes, they were. And I want to give this example because, again, I'm a great fan, of Tarabai Shinde's, of Rokea's Sultana's Dream. Okay, now, you have books like Why Loiter, etc. But in Rokea's book, Sultana's Dream, which is a very small 12-page internet, everybody will find it. Rokia, this is it's called a lady land. She dreams, she falls asleep, and she's walking around this place called Ladyland, assisted by somebody called Sister Sarah. And she walks around and she only sees women. So she said, where are the men? So Lady Sarah says, in our society, the men are in parda. And she said, but why are men in parda? They said, look, supposing there's a dangerous animal and it escapes from the forest and come into the village, what will you do? Will you cage the animal or will you cage the people? Okay, now is this common sense theory or social science theory? And this was written in 1905. Okay, this is feminist theorizing, feminist critique. You must read it. It's such an extraordinary book. And it's only now that because the West has recognized her, she's called the first feminist utopia. And I had, the privilege that they'd asked me to write a piece on her in a volume on feminist utopia brought out in the West. And I had mentioned that, she wrote this in a journal called Madras Ladies Magazine in 1905. And the referee of the people who reviewed my article, they got back, can you check the date? And the reason why they wanted to check the date, I forget the name, she's this very famous Canadian feminist who had written a feminist utopia, which was written in 1935. Okay, so they felt that how could Rokia have written this in 1905 if the feminist utopia, which is most well known in the West, was written in the 1935, okay? So when we say decoloniality, it's not just about converting words that you can decolonize. These are very deep-rooted assumptions, So Ganesh, when you say there's a hierarchy, there is a hierarchy because one, they do not realize there's no pre-theoretical. Second, especially in political science more so than in sociology, you have a distinct school which talks about political philosophy, which is a kind of different kind of theorization. and you feel that to do political philosophy is a more serious business than to go and find out stories from which. But the two are not separate. So why I kept referring to Dorothy Smith. So even in that ordinary gaze, there is theory. Is that a family? Why are they sitting here? Are they passengers? In each of those simple words, we have a particular category which is there, like sometimes you also have overall impression. Like, I don't know how many of you are familiar with C. Wright Mill's sociological imagination. And a lot of people feel C. Wright Mills is talking about imagination, okay? He's also talking about very concrete empirical question. He's saying you can't have sociological imagination if you don't ask three kinds of questions. What kind of society? Meaning, is it capitalist? Is it feudal? Is it tribal? Which section of society are you talking about? What is the structure of society? Very empirical questions. But you can't describe the structure of society unless you have a theoretical understanding of what is structure. You can't understand what is Dalit anger unless you have a theoretical understanding of what is caste structure. So you can't do empirical without the theoretical. But we have certain common sense ideas of what is theory. One is that they feel that it has to be bombastic, very big words, And very often I've been asked, but say something theoretical. I said, I've been saying things theoretical. They said, no, I mean theory, So you have a kind of abstruse idea of theory, which is also problematic, I hope that answers your question. Khushbu, probably I've answered yours too in some sense, you were asking a similar kind of question, but also the question of narratives, and that qualitative is necessarily feminist and quantitative is necessarily not. I think that is completely not right. Completely not right, both can be, it depends. I'll give you an example. 1975, we had the Towards Equality report on the first, status report post 47. And after that, many of these early feminist scholars like Veena Majumdar, etc., they started Leela Dubey. They started asking that why in the census are there so few women workers? We know women work. We walk, and we know women are, construction workers. They are, sweepers. They are piggery runners, they wash buffaloes in animal husbandry, they milk cows, they are in extended agricultural activities. We know women, they work in middle class homes, they work as housewives. Then why are they missing? And the question was found out that the reason why it was, and it's completely quantitative, census is just numbers, right? So the argument was that work was defined in a fashion to exclude most women who worked in unorganized sector. So you are counting work as only 9 to 5, regular income, fixed contract, and the large number of women, most of them who work, don't work in those sectors. So the category invisibilizes. So even in an exercise like the census, which is essentially quantitative, the theory, the way the work is defined is conceptual. So they are not dichotomous. And I think that's important to, understand. The third question, which was put on the chat board, was about the relationship between patriarchy and rituals. Well, everything is linked, say, for example, say I get married, and for me, it's like half a century, and I don't change my surname. Okay, and I think it's a very routine thing not to change my surname. And then I see the horror in my in-laws, the shock, the sense that people feel that you must be not loving us, you don't care for us, you're not part of us. These are emotional questions, okay? And it seems such a simple thing. Now, locations are important. So people will say, what's the big deal about changing a name? I mean, it's just a name. If nobody's beating you, nobody's harassing you, so why? What's the fuss? But just convert it around, turn it around. Supposing somebody addresses me by my husband's surname, I don't feel anything. I don't feel very upset. But I'm sure if he's addressed by my surname, it won't be funny. it would be seen as, how can they not know my name? Okay, so very small everyday practices stem from the larger patriarchal structure. In my part of the world where I grew up, young boys had a ceremony where they learned how to write. So the priest would come, and I remember in my brother's case, little photographs where he would take the pen and try to start writing. But I don't have any picture like that because I never had that ritual. Because girls were not supposed to be writing traditionally, right? In the sense that you were not part of that ritual. Similarly, Sangeet, the songs which are sung at weddings. So many, if you look at Leela Dubé's work on anthropology and gender, she has written down these beautiful songs, which women sing when the girl goes away from her, natal home. It's a ritual. Can you imagine the man going and people singing songs? It doesn't make sense. So rituals and customs, which we feel has an autonomous existence, is very much linked to these various questions. Traditional caste system, for example, the idea that the Nai or the Baba are also people who bring marriage proposals. They go from house to house, etc. They are the communicators, the interlocutors, who has. So there is so much about structure, custom, and culture. And each one of you can probably find out so many examples on your own, you wanted to know, Avinash, about a reading. I think nothing can be better than Leela Dubé's work. Look at Leela Dubé and then look at Sharmila Rege. So then you'll have both, perspectives of how rituals and culture are linked to patriarchy. That's what I was trying to say. Don't dump one because her work was pioneering, Leela Dubé's. And she worked, her field work was primarily in Madhya Pradesh and in that area. And she collected a lot of these songs and rituals. So do look at that. Okay, there's one more, Varsha.
Yeah, there are two questions.
Yeah, she brings in the transverse context, the transgender.
So she would like to know, like you mentioned, routinizing the theory and theorizing the gender. But as in Indian society, such areas are still undercover. So as a young scholar, how can we enroute our work towards the contemporary topics with more effectiveness where women are already struggling in Indian society per se?
Yeah, women are struggling, but knowledge is growing, and women are also growing. So in transgender, there's been some fabulous work in recent times. If you're interested in reading on transgender, say there's been a lot of work by one of our old, he's a professor in Hyderabad, Pushpesh Kumar, who's worked on transgender communities, queer sociology, working class queer people, how is it different from the more privileged new liberalism and, transgender mobilization. So that is one definite reading that you could find. He's written a lot, so it won't be difficult to find on that. When I say routinizing theory, I mean that we often use theory as a standalone. This is a theory class, and humne abhi, all these theories we have read. The most challenging part is that theory is the skill, is our binoculars to understand society, is our microscope to understand society. Theory helps us to explore and penetrate behind the facade and see what is it which is happening behind. And to answer your question, Ganesh and Khushbu, the empirical details you collect throw light on that theory. For example, I'll give you a small example. Once I was speaking on dowry. This was a kind of NGO type of group. And I was saying that, so when I was discussing dowry and property rights and marriage, so one of the young women, or not young women, she said, "Hamare mein koi jabardasti nahi hai. It's all voluntary. Dowry is voluntary. आपको ठीक लगे तो आप कुछ दे दिया बेटी को, ना ठीक लगे तो ना दिया." So I said, "आप मत दीजिए. if it is voluntary, आप मत दीजिए, साल बाद दे दीजिए. She said, ऐसा कैसा हो सकता? Now I asked, why did you say that? Then what happened was, they said that they were scared. Agar nahi diya, then there may be some reaction, no? So if you look at Durkheim, Rules of Sociological Method, he often says, how do you know something is a social fact? A social fact is a theoretical concept. He says, one is it's external, it's outside me. It is general, not because it exists in each individual, but because it exists outside the individual and the individual learns from it, and it is coercive. So if you challenge it, there will be reactions. So when the woman said, "Aisa kaisa ho sakta," she was expressing her fear, unstated, that if I don't get, and agar wo naraj ho jaye, नाराज होके हमारी बेटी को कुछ कर दिया, फिर हम क्या करेंगे? So she knew the structure of society. She couldn't speak it like a theory class in JNU, but she knew that there's something called patriarchy, and there are rules which cannot be violated without sanction. You know, so this is the thing. The other, yeah. So I think Varsha, I hope been able to understand your society. Yeah. Women, you know, Varsha, women are struggling, but women are also fighting back, no? They're not just victim, I mean, in the sense that women have created knowledge, so, you know, and there is a lot of literature you will find there. Then, yes.
We have one more question from Keshav.
Yeah.
And he says, with the admission that the archive and the terms of theory in academia have been sanctioned and institutionalized by the so-called global north, is there a need for a theory of or from global south, or can there be a global theory without the divisions of north and south?
You know, this is a good question, and I think there have been better people who responded to it. I think it was Bourdieu or somebody who said, can social science be neutral? I'll come back to your objectivity question, yeah. And can it be neutral? You know, like, can you have, and his response was, when there is no class, no caste, no race, no hierarchies, then we can have a neutral. So if there is no division between the global north and the global south, we can have a global theory. You know, in the sense it would be possible. Because then the distinction wouldn't be required. Like if there is no caste, then there would be no need for a Dalit theory, right? If there is no patriarchy, there is no need for a feminist theory. So it's the context which defines the need. But if your question is asking that is there a place for universal theory? I would say yes. I would say yes. For example, if we look at neoliberalism, as that stage of capitalism, where you have a retreat of the idea of a social welfare state, where you have a celebration of the entrepreneurial individual, and that everything is a site for profit. The academia is a site for profit. You know, universities have to decide how much revenue. Teachers have to show whether they've got a project which is bringing in money. Students have to score points to be selected for whatever or not selected. Then I would say neoliberalism is a theory which is a global theory. Like capitalism is a global theory. But the impact of that theory is differential. So capitalism is a global theory in colonialism. So you had the West, which, you know, you had the beginning of capitalism in England. Does it mean that that global theory didn't have any relevance to us? It had absolute relevance. We were colonized. We were part of that history. We were part of that story. As market, as extraction of raw materials, as destruction of artisans, traditional agricultural practices, new revenue modes, new kinds of laws, you know, bringing in of some kind of civil codes, erasure of customary laws and practices. So I would not say there's no universal theory. I would say universal theories, like a theory of capitalism, can be applicable if you recognize that they have differential impact on different places, because it is exploitative in its very nature. Just like you would say caste is an exploitative system in its very nature. But it's universal. So if I am privileged as belonging to a privileged caste, that universal theory still holds. So I think it's important, and that's why I'm a little uncomfortable of trying to say everything is particular, everything is experiential. So to answer your question, Khushbu, I think objectivity doesn't mean we are neutral. Objectivity doesn't mean that we don't have political positions. Objectivity means that we follow certain procedures when we do our fieldwork, when we theorize. So if I go to Faridabad and do a fieldwork and I say, this is my narrative, it can't be a fairy tale. So Ganesh can go to Faridabad tomorrow to the same place and say that what I said was bunkum. Okay, so there are checks and validation. So objectivity does not mean our suspension of our belief system. Objectivity means a recognition of our belief system and following certain protocols of research when you go to the field. So again, Weber is the best person. He has this wonderful essay called Objectivity in Social Sciences. So it's very densely written, but it's worth having a look. Somebody's asked for an introductory book on post-feminism. Okay. Yeah. I wouldn't be able to give you an introductory book. I have written a piece called Feminism and Popular Culture in India. I'll share it maybe with you, with Speaking for a Margin email. And in that I have a small section on post-feminism. It may, but if you want, all the posts are problematic and there are different kinds of positions. So in the West, where they felt that feminism has already achieved what it has, a section of people said, now we are in a post-feminist society, but there's been a lot of critiques on it. That is that true or not true, etc. There's also been a shift from feminism as collective and solidarity based to feminism in a neoliberal format where it's about myself, what I do, self-presentation, which is also part of post-feminism. But I have a small section, and if I can think of any quick text on it, but this article may be useful because it's giving you empirical details of how it gets expressed. So that may help you. Is that all, I think, no?
Yes, I think there was a hand by someone. I think Sonali raised a hand. I don't know if she intended to ask a question or... Sonali, do you want to ask a question? By mistake. So, any other questions? Okay. So if there are no further questions, can I now invite Ganesh to deliver a vote of thanks for today's discussion?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am, for such innovative and ingenious way of understanding social science in the current time for us, particularly as young scholars. And thank you, Khushbu. And thank you so much to our participants for joining with us and listen carefully. Thank you so much, ma'am, again.
Thank you so much for calling me. Thank you, Ganesh. Thank you.
We have one declaration that's in the upcoming week we are going to organize an orientation program for the newly interested PhD candidates, those who are trying to compete for the upcoming entrance and PhD Viva for Delhi universities, particularly those who are interested to compete in the Vivas for the Delhi University. We are going to organize an orientation in the next week. So be in touch with us, to our audience, I am saying. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
End of now.
Yes, we should be sure.